Welcome back to History for Hours. Tonight, we drift into the smoky backrooms and late-night diners of mid-century America, where deals were made over quiet conversations and trust was measured in silence. This is the world of Joseph Stacher, a man who didn't chase the spotlight, but built influence through patience, presence, and an instinct for staying one step ahead. Most people couldn't survive a life like this, not because of danger alone, but because it demanded reading rooms, understanding people, and knowing when not to speak. Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Only if you genuinely enjoy these long, slow journeys through history's hidden corners. And if you're listening right now, drop a comment with your location and local time. I love knowing where these stories travel. Now dim the lights, let the city noise fade, and settle in as we ease into the quiet, calculated world of Joseph Stacher. The story of the most important gangster you've never heard of doesn't begin with a gunshot, or a speakeasy, or the glitter of Las Vegas. It begins in silence, the deep, consuming silence of a small village at the edge of an empire, where the only sounds were the wind through the wheat and the distant rumble of history on the move. This is where we find our boy, a young Joseph Stacher, born in 1902 in a place called Horodenka. Today it's in Ukraine. Then it was a pinprick on the map of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a world of mud roads and whispered fears. Joe's first memories weren't of wealth or ambition, but of lack, of looking at a horizon that seemed to promise nothing but more of the same. His father was a cantor, a man of faith and song, but the music couldn't fill their bowls. Young Joe learned his first great lesson here, not from a book, but from the landscape. To get somewhere else, you had to be smarter, quieter, and more determined than the world around you. He was a quiet child, observant. While other boys played, he'd watch the marketplace. He saw how goods moved, how favors were traded, how a little knowledge of what someone needed could be worth more than a coin. He didn't see a village. He saw a small, slow engine of exchange. And he knew even then that the engine was too small for him. The silence of Horodenka was broken by the thunder of the First World War. Then came the chaos that followed: pogroms, upheaval, a sense that the ground itself was no longer stable. For many, this was a tragedy. For a boy with Joe's mind, it was a terrifying but clear message. The old rules were over. The only safety lay in movement, in adaptation, in finding a new system. In 1919, at 17, he made his move. He didn't storm out with a declaration. He left like he always did things, quietly, with purpose. The destination was the opposite of his quiet village. America. New York City, a roaring, seething, overflowing metropolis that was building itself, skyward by the day. He arrived not to the Statue of Liberty, but to the dense, frantic, wonderfully alive streets of the Lower East Side. It was another kind of engine entirely, a roaring, screaming, non-stop machine of humanity. A million languages, 1,000 schemes, the smell of baking bread and sewer steam, and ambition so thick you could taste it. He was just another young immigrant, lost in the crowd. But Joe Stacher didn't feel lost. He felt home. In this chaos, he saw patterns. In this noise, he heard opportunity. He took any job he could find. He pushed garment carts. He ran errands. He was polite, reliable, and fiercely sharp. He kept his eyes open and his mouth shut, absorbing the rules of this new world. And he quickly learned the most important rule of all. On these streets, power didn't come from a title or an inheritance. It came from two things: money and connections. And the quickest path to both was through the neighborhood's most vibrant, unofficial economy. The one run by young men like him, who were turning hustle into an art form. It was in a cramped, noisy cafeteria on Rivington Street that his world changed forever. He was sitting alone, calculating the meager profits of his week, when a group of young men tumbled in, crackling with an energy that seemed to bend the room around them. They were louder, sharper, dressed a bit better than the other kids. They argued about business, but it wasn't about rag trading. It was about dock shipments, police beats, and percentages. And at the center of them were two figures, opposites yet perfectly aligned. One was all flash and fire, handsome, loud, with a smile that could charm or a stare that could freeze you. This was Benjamin Siegel, who the world would later call Bugsy. The other was smaller, calmer. He didn't say much, but when he did, the others leaned in to listen. He had the cool, appraising eyes of a chess player surveying the board. This was Meyer Lansky. Joe didn't approach them. That wasn't his way. He simply made sure he was at that cafeteria more often. He listened. He learned that Lansky and Siegel ran a protection racket for the local pushcart peddlers. It was a simple, brutal business. But Joe's mind, trained on Horodenka's marketplace, saw the inefficiency. One day, as the group complained about a peddler who was late on his dues, Joe, wiping a nearby table, spoke without looking up. "He's not hiding," Joe said, his voice low but clear. "His sister is sick. He spends his afternoons at the clinic on Broome Street. You find him there after 4, you look like a bully. You send a basket of fruit to the sister first thing in the morning, you look like a benefactor. He'll pay you double next week out of gratitude, and he'll never be late again." The table went quiet. The fiery one, Siegel, stared at him, amused. But it was Lansky who turned. Those cool eyes swept over Joe, not seeing a busboy, but a calculator. He didn't smile. He just gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "What's your name?" Lansky asked. "Joe. Joe Stacher." "Sit down, Joe," Lansky said. It wasn't an invitation. It was an instruction. Joe Stacher sat. He didn't know it yet, but in that moment, he had left the world of pushing carts and running errands forever. He had just conducted his first successful negotiation, not with muscle but with psychology. He had offered a better system, and Meyer Lansky, a man who would build an empire on finding and exploiting better systems, had just found his most valuable partner. The silent boy from Horodenka was gone. The man who would learn to make billions of dollars disappear was taking his seat at the table. His education was about to begin. The cafeteria table became Joe Stacher's new classroom. Its textbooks were whispered ledgers, its lessons delivered in code over plates of stew. Lansky, the professor, had a mind that worked like a precision lathe, turning chaotic street schemes into smooth, profitable operations. Siegel was the explosive lab experiment, a lesson in both brilliant potential and dangerous volatility. And Stacher, the quiet transfer student from a world of silence, proved to be the star pupil. His first assignments were small tests. A disputed debt between 2 garment suppliers needed resolving without fists. A shipment of canned goods, the code for smuggled whiskey, needed a new, untraceable route from the Hoboken docks to a network of blind pigs in Brooklyn. Lansky would outline the problem, then watch. Siegel would suggest a show of force, but Joe would ask a single, quiet question. What's the real blockage? For the debt, it wasn't stubbornness, but a supplier's shame over a failed side business. Joe arranged a small, anonymous loan to cover that failure, making the main debt repayable. The money flowed and loyalty was cemented. For the whiskey route, the blockage was a corrupt but greedy police sergeant on the original path. Instead of confronting him or paying his inflated fee, Joe found the sergeant's superior, a captain with a sick child and massive hospital bills. A donation from a neighborhood charity found its way to the hospital. The captain, grateful and suspicious, reassigned the sergeant to a distant post. The route was clear. Joe's solution wasn't just clever. It was structural. He didn't attack symptoms. He quietly altered the underlying conditions. He was fixing problems not with a hammer, but with a subtle, almost surgical adjustment of the machinery. Lansky called him Doc, not just as a nickname for Stacher, but with a note of genuine respect. The doctor was in, and his specialty was the health of the enterprise. Prohibition was the roaring engine of their young empire, and money was gushing in. But cash, as Joe quickly identified, was a dangerous, noisy, and smelly problem. Physical dollars piled up in suitcases and safe houses. They attracted rats, mold, and, more dangerously, the attention of beat cops and taxmen. The gangs. Brute force brilliance was in making the money. Their glaring weakness was in managing it. One evening, in the back room of a social club Lansky controlled, this tension spilled over. Siegel was furious, pacing. "It's a mountain in there, Meyer. A mountain. And we're paying muscle to babysit paper. He gestured wildly to a locked door, behind which sat stacks of cash from the week's rum running. Lansky, sipping tea, looked at Joe. "Doc, the patient is suffering from excess prosperity." Diagnosis. Joe had been thinking about this for weeks. He'd been watching the legitimate businesses on the Lower East Side, the ones owned by the old, established families. The bakeries, the laundries, the small factories. "We need to make the money quiet," Joe said, his voice even. "Right now it's screaming. Cash screams. We need to turn it into something that whispers." "How?" Siegel snapped, impatient with theory. "We buy whispers," Joe said. He laid out his idea, the first iteration of what would become his life's work. They wouldn't just hide the money. They would transform it. They would invest in those quiet, legitimate businesses, not to run them, but to own them quietly. A portion of the bakery's daily flour purchase would be paid with their loud cash. The bakery's books would show a legitimate, if slightly higher, cost for flour. The bakery's profits, now clean, would be returned to the owners as a dividend. The dirty money had been baked into bread and emerged fresh and clean. It was a simple, beautiful two-step process. Infiltration, then transformation. Lansky's eyes gleamed. It was more than a hiding place. It was an alchemy. "Start with the Feldman Laundry on Delancey," Lansky instructed. "The old man wants to retire. His son wants to go to college. Buy it. Be generous. Then show me how the soap bubbles clean." Joe's apprenticeship shifted. He was no longer just a solver of discrete problems. He was now the architect of a system. He negotiated the purchase of Feldman Laundry, paying above market price. He kept the old employees, even gave them a raise. The volume of hot water used by the boiler tripled, according to the books, a necessary cost for their new, high-volume contract with several downtown hotels. The hotels didn't exist, but the cash that paid for the extra coal and water did. Soon, the laundry was generating a healthy, documented, taxable profit. A portion of that profit was skimmed back to Lansky as a silent partner's share. Joe learned to speak the language of legitimate commerce, depreciation, overhead, net versus gross. He saw that the world of business and the world of the street weren't separate. They were two theaters, and he was learning to direct plays in both simultaneously. His greatest weapon became his appearance. He dressed conservatively. He spoke softly. He carried a briefcase, not a blackjack. He looked like an accountant, a modest small business owner. He was a ghost in plain sight, moving through the world of light without casting a shadow the authorities could trace. His success bred a quiet, immense trust from Lansky, and it also bred a low-grade, simmering resentment from Bugsy Siegel. Siegel's power came from his aura of terrifying possibility, his willingness to cross lines others wouldn't. Joe's power came from making the lines themselves disappear. To Siegel, it felt like sorcery, and it irritated him. Their rivalry wasn't a feud. It was a fundamental clash of ideologies. Force versus finesse. The Great Depression hit the country like a sledgehammer. Breadlines formed. Fortunes vanished. But in the shadow economy Lansky and Stacher were building, business boomed. When people couldn't afford legal hope, they turned to illegal consolation. Their numbers rackets, their cheap gin, their clandestine card games. The cash mountain grew ever larger. It was during these desperate, hungry years that Joe Stacher fully understood his purpose. He wasn't in the business of crime. He was in the business of liquidity. He was the unblocker of capital, the quiet river that directed the flood of underground wealth into reservoirs where it could be used, safely, to build something bigger. Lansky had the vision for an empire. Siegel had the terrifying will to seize territory. Charlie Luciano, the rising strategic star, had the political cunning to forge alliances. But Joe? He was the one who built the plumbing. And as the decade turned and Prohibition ended, collapsing the old business model, the syndicate would need his plumbing more than ever. They were about to enter a new, more complex game. And the quiet boy from Horodenka, now a man who could make $1 million vanish into the steam of a laundry, was ready to build the pipeline to the future. The end of Prohibition didn't arrive with a bang, but with a clink of perfectly legal glassware. On December 5, 1933, the 21st Amendment was ratified, and just like that, the golden goose that had fed their empire for over a decade was declared mundane. Ordinary. Commodity. In the back rooms and social clubs, a low-grade panic set among the rank and file. Bootleggers, truck drivers, enforcers, men whose entire world was built on the illegality of a bottle, faced an existential crisis. What were they now? Their skills, their routes, their corrupt alliances with Coast Guard officers and Treasury agents were suddenly obsolete. It felt like the sun had set on their world for good. But in a private office above a perfectly legitimate linen supply company, one of Joe Stacher's early whisper investments, a different meeting was taking place. The air was thick not with panic, but with calculation. Lansky sat behind a clean desk. Luciano, sharp and impeccably dressed, stood by the window, looking down at the legitimate traffic. Joe Stacher was pouring 3 glasses of now legal scotch. "They're having a wake out there," Luciano said, not turning from the window. "They think it's over." "It's not over," Lansky said, his voice a dry rasp. "The party's over. The business is just beginning. We're not in the alcohol business, Charlie. We never were." Luciano turned. "Then what business are we in?" Lansky gestured to Joe. "Document tell him what business we're in." Joe placed the glasses down. He'd spent weeks thinking about this, tracing the flow of their capital like a doctor tracing a nervous system. "We're in the desire business," Joe said calmly. Prohibition was about one specific desire, for a drink. But that was just the proof of concept. People don't just desire alcohol. They desire chance. They desire escape. They desire a shortcut, a thrill, something forbidden that feels like freedom. The government just took one product off the forbidden list. Our job is to find the next one, and the one after that. He walked to a chalkboard they kept in the corner, a tool for mapping distribution routes now repurposed. He drew 3 large circles. "Gambling," he said, labeling the first circle. "The oldest desire. Cards, dice, numbers. It's everywhere, but it's a messy, street corner operation. We organize it. We syndicate it. We make it reliable for the customer and profitable for us." He labeled the second circle. "Labor. Every dock, every truck, every construction site. That's not a cost. That's a choke point. Control the choke point, you get a percentage of everything that flows through it. It's a tax on the legitimate world." He labeled the third. "Finance. This is the one they never see. This is the machine that makes the other 2 work. Moving money, cleaning it, lending it. This," he said, tapping the third circle, "is the business that never ends. Desire changes. Labor mutates. But money always needs to move." Lansky smiled, a rare, thin expression. "We're not gangsters. We're utility providers. We provide services the government forbids or fails to provide. And we're going to be a national utility." This was the birth of the true national crime. Syndicate. Not as a romantic band of outlaws, but as a shadow corporation. Luciano, with his political genius, would handle structure and alliance, merging the Italian families and other groups into a coherent board of directors. Lansky would be the CEO, the strategic mind. And Joe Stacher? He was being promoted to chief financial officer and head of logistics. His first monumental task under the new regime was the numbers racket in Harlem. It was a sprawling, chaotic, beautiful monster. For a penny, a dreamer could bet on a 3-digit number. The payoffs could be life-changing. It was the lottery of the poor, but run by 100 independent operators warring over corners. The violence was bad for business. The inconsistency scared off customers. Joe's solution was a masterstroke of corporate branding and financial engineering. He proposed a central bank for the numbers. All bets would flow to a single, impeccably managed pool. The odds would be standardized. The payouts would be guaranteed and prompt, no matter which runner you placed your bet with. It would be, to the customer, as reliable as mailing a letter at the post office. To the independent operators, he offered a franchise model. They kept a generous commission for collecting bets. In return, they got peace, protection, and the credibility of the syndicate bank. Those who refused were not met with violence as a first resort. They were met with economic suffocation. Runners who worked for them would be offered better commissions. Their best book men would be hired away. Customers would hear rumors that the holdouts' bank couldn't cover big wins. Within months, the holdouts would either join or wither away. Joe set up the bank's headquarters in a nondescript office near the garment district. He hired 3 legitimate accountants, men with families and mortgages who asked no questions about their clients, only about the columns of figures. The cash from thousands of daily penny bets flowed in, was counted, logged, and the vast profits skimmed off the top before the prize pool was calculated. It was a river of small change that collectively built a dam of immense wealth. It was during this project that Joe had his defining clash with Bugsy Siegel. Siegel saw the numbers operation as soft, bureaucratic. He wanted to muscle in, take it over with a show of terrifying force, and run it with an iron fist. He stormed into the linen company office one afternoon. "You're turning a street operation into a damn savings and loan. Doc, where's the respect? You think you can run this with accountants?" Joe didn't look up from his ledger. "I don't want respect, Ben. I want reliability. Respect you have to enforce every day. Reliability runs itself. A woman in Harlem doesn't bet her penny for the thrill of fearing us. She bets it for the dream of winning. I'm selling her the dream, clean and simple. You want to sell fear. Fear is a cost. Dreams are pure profit." Siegel stared, his famous temper boiling. But he had no counter-argument. He dealt in the tangible. Fear, loyalty, territory. Joe was dealing in the intangible, trust, consistency, systemic confidence. They were speaking different languages. Lansky, witnessing this, knew both men were invaluable, but for different futures. Siegel was a conqueror, a frontline general for new, violent ventures. Stacher was a civil engineer, building the foundations of a lasting state. As the 1930s wore on, Joe's systems hummed. The cash from gambling and labor rackets flowed into his whisper businesses, the laundries, the linen companies, the small breweries now legitimately reopened. The money was cleaned, ready for reinvestment. The syndicate was no longer just surviving the end of Prohibition. It was thriving, diversifying, becoming embedded in the very fabric of the economy. But Joe knew a ceiling was approaching. There was only so much cash you could bake into bread or wash with linen in New York. The river of illicit. Wealth was growing faster than his reservoirs could hold. He needed a new frontier, a place where the rules were still being written, where cash was king and questions were few. He began to look at maps, his eyes drifting away from the crowded, regulated East. His gaze settled on a dot in the middle of a vast, empty desert. A dot with a name that sounded like a sigh of relief, a place where everything was possible precisely because nothing was yet there. Las Vegas, Nevada. The doctor had diagnosed the next great need. The system required a release valve, and he was already sketching the plans. The desert was not empty. That was Joe Stacher's first thought as he stepped off the train in downtown Las Vegas in the fall of 1945. The air was empty. The sky was empty. The vast stretches of dust and rock were empty. But the place, this dusty railroad stop clinging to the edge of a valley, was crackling with a frenetic, desperate energy. It was a raw nerve ending. Men in suits stained with sweat talked in low, urgent clusters. The clang of construction was a constant, off-rhythm beat against the dry heat. Everywhere he looked, he saw frames of buildings rising like skeletons against the blue sky. It wasn't a city. It was a blueprint shouted into the wilderness. And Joe understood immediately. This was where you built something from nothing if you had the nerve and the capital. More importantly for him, it was where you could spend money, vast, unquestioned amounts of it, on concrete, steel, and dreams no eyebrows raised. He hadn't come because of Bugsy Siegel's grandiose letters, filled with exclamation points about paradise in the desert. He'd come because Meyer Lansky had slid a spreadsheet across the table to him in New York. 2 columns. On the left, the syndicate's estimated monthly cash flow from its national operations. On the right, the estimated maximum monthly capacity of their current laundry, linen, and vending machine fronts to clean that cash. The left, Column was nearly double the right. The numbers were screaming again. "The desert dock," Lansky had said, tapping the left column. "It's a sponge. A legal, wide open, glorious sponge. Siegel's there. He's got vision, but vision pours concrete. It doesn't manage cement trucks. Go see. Tell me if it's a release valve or a sinkhole." Joe found Siegel not in an office, but in the middle of a sprawling, half-finished crater off a lonely highway headed toward Los Angeles. This was the Flamingo. Siegel stood atop a pile of lumber, waving blueprints like a conductor, his shirt plastered to his back, his eyes blazing with a messianic light. He looked, Joe thought, less like a businessman and more like a prophet who had seen the future and was desperately trying to physically drag it into the present. "Doc, you see it!" Siegel yelled, scrambling down to clap him on the back. The heat was a physical wall. "This isn't a casino. It's a cathedral. Air conditioning. A fancy restaurant. Top-tier entertainers from Hollywood. We're not getting the grifters and the nickel slots crowd. We're getting the swells, the movie stars, the high rollers. They'll fly in, lose a fortune in style, and thank us for the privilege." Joe walked the site quietly as Siegel talked to Torrent. He saw the grandiose vision. The garden, the pool, the curved lines meant to evoke Miami luxury. But his accountant's eyes saw other things. Piles of Italian marble, sourced at a premium, sitting uncovered and cracking in the sun. Overtime bills for crews working around the clock under arc lights. Change orders scrawled on scraps of paper. A river of cash was being poured directly onto the burning sand, and most of it was evaporating. That night, in Siegel's temporary bungalow, the clash was immediate and fundamental. Siegel spread the glamorous architectural renderings on the table. Joe spread his notepad, covered in columns of figures. "The budget, Ben," Joe said, his voice calm in the face of Siegel's fervor. "You're 30% over, and you haven't even furnished the rooms." "Budget?" Siegel laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. "You don't build a revolution on a budget, Doc. You build it on faith.
Un spectacle.
The money will come. A millionaire loses 50 grand at the baccarat table. What does he care if the marble came from Italy or Arizona?" Joe pointed to a line in his notes. "The plumbing contractor. You fired him twice and rehired him 3 times at a higher rate each time. That's not faith. That's poor management. It signals desperation. Desperation is a cost we can't afford. The boys back east, they see costs. They don't see cathedrals." Siegel's smile vanished. "The boys back east didn't have the guts to see this. I'm out here in the furnace building it for them. You and Meyer, you think in ledgers. I think in legacy." "That's the problem," Joe said, not unkindly, but with the finality of a doctor delivering a diagnosis. "You're building a monument. We need a machine that takes in dirty money from all over the country, runs it through the slots, the tables, the hotel bills, and spits out clean profits on a financial statement. The chandeliers and the singers are just the decoration on the turbine. Right now, Ben, you're building the most expensive decoration in the world, and there's no engine in the room." The silence between them was vast, filled only with the buzz of a desert insect against the screen door. It was the silence of 2 planets orbiting different suns. Siegel was building a symbol. Stacher needed a utility. Joe did not return to New York defeated. He returned with a 2-part plan. For Lansky and the Commission, he presented a cold analysis. Siegel's Flamingo, as currently managed, would be a catastrophic money pit. But the concept, a luxury resort casino that acted as a magnet for clean tourist dollars and a laundry for syndicate capital, was flawless. The proposal contained Siegel, appoint a shadow project manager to control the budgets and timelines. Let Siegel be the front man, the charismatic face, while a quieter, more methodical team built the actual machine behind the curtain. The second part of his plan was his own insurance policy. While the syndicate focused on the troubled Flamingo, Joe began cultivating other opportunities in Vegas. He made quiet trips, meeting with the few other casino owners on Fremont Street, less glamorous, more practical men who ran places like the El Cortez and the Pioneer Club. He didn't talk about cathedrals. He talked about water rights, electrical infrastructure, and airline routes. He offered not visions, but solutions. He could facilitate financing for their expansions. Financing that didn't ask pesky questions about the source of funds. In return, he would take a small, silent partnership. He was building a network, a diversified portfolio, so that all the syndicate's eggs weren't in one unstable, visionary basket. Back in New York, Lansky approved the containment plan for Siegel. But he saw the deeper genius in Joe's own maneuvers. "You're not just building a backstop, Doc," Lansky said, a note of admiration in his voice. "You're building the second front. If the flagship flounders, you'll already own the harbor." Joe merely nodded. It was simple risk management. He had learned it watching the cautious farmers in Horodenka. Never bet your entire harvest on one field. In the summer of 1946, as the Flamingo's opening was delayed again, and the cost overruns became a terrifying joke among the syndicate's brass, Joe Stacher received a call. It was from a frustrated concrete supplier in Las Vegas, one of the men he'd shared a quiet drink with. "Your friend," the man said, his voice tense, "is bouncing checks, big ones, and he's talking about buying $1 million starlet to be the face of the joint. People are starting to whisper, Joe. The wrong kind of whisper." Joe hung up and looked at the map on his wall. The dot labeled Las Vegas Pelst. The release valve was about to either open wide or explode. Siegel was pouring not just money, but the syndicate's credibility into the desert sand. And in the world of shadow capital, credibility was the only currency that truly mattered. The doctor had diagnosed the infection. Unchecked ambition mixed with financial chaos. The question now was not just about saving the patient, but about saving the entire delicate ecosystem they had built. He booked a return ticket to Nevada. This time, he wasn't going to assess. He was going to intervene. The desert was about to learn that the quiet man with the ledger was, in fact, the most dangerous man in the room. The heat in Las Vegas in the summer of 1946 wasn't just a weather condition. It was a physical presence, a heavy, dusty blanket that seemed to press the desperation deeper into the soil. Joe Stacher felt it the moment he stepped off the plane, but the more oppressive weight was the silence that greeted him. The frantic construction clamor he'd heard months before was gone. At the Flamingo site, the silence was broken only by the flapping of a loose tarpaulin and the muttered curses of a lone caretaker smoking in the shade of a dormant cement mixer. The cathedral had become a ghost town. He found Bugsy Siegel not on a pile of lumber, but in a darkened bungalow at the far edge of the property, the blinds drawn against the punishing sun. The prophet's fire was out. In its place was a smoldering, defensive tension. Spread across every surface, the table, the floor, the chairs were not blueprints but invoices. A snowdrift of past due notices, material lists, and angry letters from subcontractors. "They're vultures, Doc," Siegel said, his voice hoarse. He didn't look up. "They see a stumble and they swarm. No vision. No fight." Joe said nothing. He set his suitcase down, took off his jacket, and rolled up his sleeves. He picked up a random invoice from the table, a bill for custom-etched glass. Ashtrays from a company in Los Angeles. The amount was staggering. He placed it back down. A single, precise movement that sounded louder than a shout in the quiet room. "Where are the books, Ben?" Joe asked, his voice devoid of accusation, clean and clinical as a scalpel. "What books?" Siegel snapped, finally looking up. His eyes were bloodshot. "You think I've had time for bookkeeping? I've been fighting a war out here, keeping the unions off our backs, sweet-talking the suppliers, dealing with the goddamn county commissioners." Joe had heard this song before. It was the anthem of every failing business owner from Horodenka to Harlem. The world was against them, a conspiracy of small minds. He had learned you never argued with the song. You simply changed the record. "All right," Joe said, calm as still water. "From this moment, you are no longer fighting the war. You are the general in the command tent. I am your quartermaster. My job is to get supplies to the front. Your job is to look like a general who knows the supplies will come." He saw a flicker of relief in Siegel's eyes, quickly masked by pride. Siegel was exhausted. The weight of the tangible failure, the stopped construction, the angry men at his gate was crushing him. The abstract weight of finance, the very thing crushing him, was the weight Joe was built to carry. "Give me the checkbook," Joe said. "Every invoice, every contract, every scrap of paper with a number on it. And get me the foreman, not the one you like, the one who knows where every 2x4 is supposed to go." What followed was not a negotiation, but a triage. For 3 days and nights, Joe lived in that bungalow. He created order from chaos. He separated the invoices into 3 piles. Pile A, critical path. These were the debts that, if unpaid, would cause total collapse. The concrete company that could place a lien on the property, the electrical subcontractor whose work was needed before walls could be closed up. Pile B, operational. Asterisk asterisk essential services and materials to actually finish and open the casino and hotel core. Pile C, the vision. The Italian marble, the $1 million starlet, the gold leaf ceiling details. Pile C he swept into a cardboard box and placed in a closet. He then made a series of phone calls, not to New York for a bailout, but to his own cultivated network. He called the concrete supplier who had first alerted him. "Frank," Joe said, his voice even, "the check is in the mail. You have my personal word. In return, I need your crew back on site tomorrow at 7 a.m. And I need you to call your friends at the lumber yard and the plumbing supply. Tell them the same. Checks are in the mail. The project is back on." His word, his quiet, unshakable word, was the only collateral he offered. And because he had spent years building a reputation not on fear, but on impeccable reliability, it worked. The silent partners he'd courted in the other casinos vouched for him. "If Doc Stacher says it," they told the suppliers, "it's as good as gold." Within 72 hours, the site stirred back to life. The noise returned, the bang of hammers, the shout of foremen. It was a controlled, focused noise, directed by the priority list Joe had created. Siegel, seeing activity, regained a shard of his charisma. He was back on site, playing the general, his spirits lifted by the illusion of momentum Joe had manufactured. But in the quiet of the bungalow each night, Joe faced the true numbers. The gap was a canyon. The syndicate's initial investment was not just spent. It was overspent by a margin that would make even Lansky blanch. The money sent to cover the critical path debts had come from an emergency reserve Joe managed. A fund meant for opportunities, not catastrophes. He knew the reports he was sending back to New York, copied to Lansky and the Commission, were a form of financial life support. They showed a patient stabilized, but they hid the catastrophic internal bleeding. He was buying time, but for what? His answer came from an unexpected source. One evening, a man named Morris Kleinman, a quiet partner from Cleveland who had invested in the Flamingo through the syndicate, paid him a visit. Kleinman was not a street guy. He was a businessman who understood numbers. He looked at Joe's neat piles, at the ledger showing the terrifying deficit. "You're putting a very nice bandage on a severed artery, Joe," Kleinman said softly, tapping the ledger. "I'm keeping the patient alive long enough to find a new blood supply," Joe replied, not looking up. Kleinman nodded. "The word in Chicago, in New York, in Miami, it's not good. They're saying the desert is swallowing money. They're saying Siegel has lost his mind. They're saying the whole Vegas play is a sinkhole." He leaned forward. "But I look at what you've done here in a week. The suppliers are back. The work is moving. You didn't do that with a gun. You did it with a phone and a reputation. That tells me the problem isn't the desert. The problem is the man building the wrong thing in it." He slid a folded piece of paper across the table. It was a short list of names and numbers, powerful, patient money from the Midwest, men who were not part of the volatile New York Commission. "These men believe in the machine, Joe, not the monument. If you were building the machine, they might find more capital. Quiet capital." Joe understood. This wasn't just about saving the Flamingo. This was about a quiet coup, a transfer of confidence. The syndicate was losing faith in the visionary. The smart money was starting to look at the accountant. He took the paper. He didn't commit. He simply said, "The patient needs to show it can walk on its own. It needs an opening night." His mission was now twofold. Get the Flamingo to a grand opening, a spectacle that would silence the doubters back east and restore cash flow. And simultaneously, he would begin conversations about what a truly solvent, efficiently run casino operation, a machine, not a monument, would look like, and who should be its chief engineer. The grand opening of the Flamingo was set for December 26, 1946. It would be the most crucial performance of Bugsy Siegel's life. And as the date hurtled toward them, Joe Stacher worked tirelessly to build the stage, knowing that no matter how the show was received, the script for the future of Vegas was being rewritten by him in the quiet of the bungalow, one calculated figure at a time. December 26, 1946. The night air in the desert was cold enough to crackle, a sharp contrast to the feverish warmth radiating from the newly finished porte-cochere of the Flamingo. Limousines, longer and shinier than most of the local houses, disgorged a spectacle of fur, silk, and gleaming smiles. Searchlights borrowed from a Hollywood studio cut through the black velvet sky. The sound of a live orchestra spilled out into the parking lot. It was everything Bugsy Siegel had promised. A mirage of elegance and excess made startlingly real in the middle of nowhere. From a second-floor office with a one-way window overlooking the casino floor, Joe Stacher watched the illusion come to life. He saw Siegel, resplendent in a tuxedo, working the room like a master politician, clasping hands, kissing cheeks, laughing a little too loudly. He saw the Hollywood faces, some A-list, many B-list, drawn by curiosity and free champagne. He saw the high rollers from back east, eyes already calculating odds at the lush new baccarat tables. To them, it was a party. To Joe, it was the first live test of a complex machine. His eyes weren't on the celebrities. They were on the dealers' hands, the chip racks, the waitstaff's flow through the crowd. He had a notepad in his hand, but he didn't write down the glamour. He noted the bottlenecks. The cashier's cage where the line was too long, the poorly placed craps table causing a traffic jam, the delay in drink service at the far end of the room. Each was a friction point, a place where money or time, which was the same thing, was being lost. Down on the floor, the illusion was fragile. The beautiful plaster in the lobby was still slightly damp to the touch. In the luxurious guest rooms, faucets shrieked when turned on, and some toilets ran continuously. The kitchen, staffed by a crew Siegel had poached from New York at great expense, was in a state of near mutiny over the unfamiliar, rushed equipment. But the champagne flowed, the band played, and the sheer novelty of it all papered over the cracks. For one night, the dream held. The real test came at the tables. Joe watched the money flow. It was good, very good. The high rollers were playing serious stakes. The wheel was spinning, the cards were flicking, and the house edge, that beautiful, relentless mathematical law, was quietly doing its work. For a few hours, standing in his observation perch, Joe allowed himself to believe the machine might actually work. The release valve was open. The dirty river from back east could flow here, get churned through the glamour of legal gambling, and emerge as pristine, reported profit. Then, in the early hours of the morning, Siegel burst into the office, his tie loosened, his face flushed with triumph and scotch. He slammed a fistful of cash, big denomination bills, onto Joe's desk. "You see that, Doc? You feel that? That's the sound of them being wrong. All of them. This is just the beginning." Joe looked at the money, then back at the window. "The take from table 3 is 15% below the house average for the night. The dealer is too slow. He's killing our edge." Siegel's grin didn't falter, but it hardened. "Will you forget the percentages for one night? Look at what we built. They said it couldn't be done." "It's not built yet, Ben," Joe said, his voice quiet but cutting through Siegel's euphoria. "A party isn't a business. The kitchen is $6,000 over budget this week alone. The plumbing. Failures in the north wing will cost 10 grand to fix before we can rent those rooms. The take on the floor tonight is strong, but it's a fraction of what we need to cover the carrying costs of the debt on this place for 1 month." He slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. It was a simplified balance sheet. On one side, the night's impressive gross win. On the other, the staggering monthly nut. Debt service, payroll for the army of staff, utilities for the air-conditioned palace in the desert, the loss leader costs of the gourmet food and free booze for the high rollers. The bottom line was a deep, swimming pool of red ink. "We didn't make a profit tonight, Ben," Joe said. "We paid for about 8 hours of the interest on the money we borrowed. We need 30 days like this every day just to stand still. And the Hollywood crowd goes home tomorrow." The triumph drained from Siegel's face, replaced by a stubborn, cornered defiance. "You don't get it. You never did. This is about creating a tide. The tide lifts all boats. My boats. Your boats. The money will come. The tide is made of water, Ben," Joe said, exhausted. "Not hope. And we're leaking it faster than it can come in." The weeks that followed were a slow-motion unraveling. The Hollywood crowd left. The high rollers, finding the service spotty and the rooms imperfect, drifted back to more reliable clubs in Havana or the cozy illegal joints in New York. The Flamingo was left with the tourists, the curious, and the low-stakes grind. The beautiful machine was operating at a fraction of its capacity, but its costs remained those of a full-throttle luxury liner. Joe's reports to New York became grimly factual. He stopped managing the crisis for Siegel and started managing the exposure for the syndicate. He funneled just enough cash to keep the doors open, a drip feed to maintain the illusion of viability while he executed the second part of his plan, the quiet conversations. He met with Morris, Kleinman's associates, in hotel rooms in downtown Vegas and over steak dinners in Los Angeles. He didn't sell the sizzle of the Flamingo. He sold the steak of the Vegas concept itself. "Look at the numbers from every other club on Fremont Street," he'd say, showing clean, profitable ledgers from the El Cortez. Smaller, efficient, focused on the grind. No marble, no starlets, just the mathematics of chance, served with a cheap steak dinner. The Flamingo is the proof of concept gone wrong, but the concept itself is sound. What's needed is not a visionary, but a mechanic. He was pitching a takeover.
A silent, bloodless coup.
Not with bullets, but with bond covenants and debt assumption. The Midwest money, cooler and more patient than the volatile New York pool, was interested. In the spring of 1947, the final, irrevocable break came. A syndicate envoy arrived from New York, a grim-faced man who represented the commission's collective impatience. He met with Joe first. "Lansky wants your read, not Siegel's. The final read." Joe gave it to him straight. "The asset is salvageable only under new management. The current management is a financial hemophilia. He cannot be trusted with a bankroll. Every dollar sent is a dollar lost. The only path to recouping the investment is to remove him, recapitalize with disciplined money, and run it as a utility, not a fantasy." The envoy then met with Siegel. The meeting behind closed doors was loud, ending with the sound of shattering glass. Later, Siegel found Joe at his post by the one-way window. "They're turning on me," Siegel hissed, his voice trembling with a lethal mix of rage and betrayal. "After all I've done. And you're the one poisoning the well, with your numbers and your whispers." Joe turned to face him. There was no fear, only a profound weariness. "I'm not poisoning it, Ben. I'm just telling them the water is toxic. You poisoned it yourself. With every overpaid contractor, every insane extravagance. You built a temple to yourself and called it a business. The congregation has left." Siegel stared at him, and in that moment, Joe saw the understanding finally break through the fury. Siegel saw not a rival, but an auditor, and the audit was complete. The books were closed. The visionary was now a liability on a balance sheet that needed to be cleaned up. Joe left Las Vegas a few days later. His work there was done. The Flamingo would struggle on for a few more months, a glittering zombie. The syndicate's patience had run out. The reports from the desert had been clear, consistent, and damning. They all bore the calm, rational, unforgiving signature of Joseph Stacher. He flew back to New York, to the familiar, grimy order of his ledgers and his laundry businesses. He knew what happened to liabilities in their world. He had calculated the risk not just to Siegel but to the entire Vegas project. A clean break was necessary for the machine to live. Sometimes a single, failing component had to be removed for the whole system to function. He did not make the decision, but his numbers did. And on a warm June evening in 1947, in a Beverly Hills mansion, the decision those numbers dictated was carried out. The visionary was silenced. The machine, however, was just getting started. And its new chief engineer was already back in his office, studying maps, not of the desert, but of a distant, ancient land where a different kind of fortress could be built. The air in New York tasted of soot and old money. It was a familiar taste to Joe Stacher, one of settled patterns and entrenched systems. He returned to it after the explosive, dusty drama of Vegas with a sense of grim completion. The Flamingo episode was a closed ledger. The final, violent entry in that ledger, the news from Beverly Hills in June of 1947, had reached him not as a shock, but as a bleak confirmation of his own calculations. In their world, an uncontainable financial leak became a physical one. It was a brutal arithmetic, but it was the arithmetic they lived by. He did not celebrate. He did not mourn. He analyzed. The Nevada project had proven two things with painful clarity. First, the American desert was the perfect sponge for their capital. Second, the American legal and political system was becoming a rapidly tightening vice. The Flamingo had attracted not just high rollers, but the focused, unwelcome attention of the IRS and the FBI's nascent racket squad. Vegas was a solution, but it was a solution bathed in a harsh, revealing light. They needed a shadow, a deeper, quieter, more secure vault. His mind, always a compass seeking magnetic north in the field of risk, began to search. He pored over international newspapers, not the headlines about crises, but the small print about banking regulations, trade agreements, and emerging nations. His gaze settled on a name that appeared with increasing frequency. Israel. Not yet a state, but a promise. A nation being forged in the wake of war, desperate for capital, for building, for legitimacy. A place where the rules were not yet just being bent, but were being written. To the outside world, it seemed an odd pivot. From the glittering casinos of Vegas to the rocky soil of the eastern Mediterranean. But to Joe, it was a logical progression. Vegas was the front end, the dazzling store where the product, clean money, was sold. What they lacked was the back end. The secure, offshore factory where the raw material, dirty cash, could be processed in total privacy, away from all prying eyes. Israel, he began to suspect, could be that factory. He needed intelligence, but not the kind gathered by enforcers. He needed the kind gathered by bankers and diplomats. He reached out to his most discreet contacts in the world of Jewish philanthropy and Zionism, a world that overlapped in quiet corners with his own. He wasn't Meyer Lansky, whose pro-Israel fervor was both genuine and pragmatic. Joe's interest was purely systemic. He attended charity galas not to be seen, but to listen. He made anonymous, substantial donations to causes related to Israeli infrastructure, always through layered intermediaries. The goal was not goodwill, but access to a specific stratum of person. The technocrats, the lawyers, the men drafting the commercial codes for the nascent state. In early 1948, through this filtered network, he was introduced to a man named Jacob Eshkol. Eshkol was not a politician in the traditional sense. He was a fixer, a facilitator for the Jewish Agency, a man whose genius lay in connecting problems with resources. They met in a modest office in Midtown Manhattan, the air thick with the smell of strong coffee and urgency. "Your contributions have been noted, Mr. Stacher," Eshkol began, his English precise, his eyes missing nothing. "They are atypically pragmatic, directed at ports, at roads." "A nation is a machine, Mr. Eshkol," Joe replied, stirring his coffee slowly. "It needs conduits. Things must flow in and things must flow out. I'm interested in flow." Eshkol smiled, a thin, understanding line. "And what is it you wish to flow into Israel? Not just tractors, I think. Confidence," Joe said, meeting his gaze, "in the form of capital. Large, mobile, investment-ready capital. My associates control significant streams of it. But these streams are shy. They fear exposure. They require privacy and stability above all else. All capital is welcome," Eshkol said carefully, "but we have laws. We will have a central bank. There will be transparency with our allies, especially the Americans. Joe leaned forward, his voice dropping to its most persuasive, reasonable register. This was the pitch he had been honing. Transparency is for governments. Growth is for pioneers. You are building a nation in a neighborhood of wolves. You need walls, yes, but you also need engines. I am talking about creating a special kind of engine, a financial engine. Imagine a bank or a series of banks chartered under Israeli law but designed for international private capital. Capital that commits to investing a percentage of its holdings in Israeli development bonds, in construction, in industry. In return, that capital enjoys a sovereign promise of confidentiality. It becomes legally Israeli capital, protected. He was describing a sovereign haven, a place where money could change its passport. Eshkol's face was impassive, but Joe saw the flicker in his eyes, the recognition of a breathtaking, a moral opportunity. Here was a man offering not a handout, but a partnership with the shadow treasury of the American underworld, a partnership that could bypass slow-moving World Bank loans and skeptical American foreign aid. The legal framework for such a thing does not exist, Eshkol said slowly. Laws, Joe replied with a slight shrug, are just another form of architecture. They can be drafted. My associates are prepared to fund the drafting. Quietly, we have the best financial lawyers in the world. They could consult. The meeting ended without a handshake, but with a shared understanding. A channel was open. Over the following months, as Israel fought its war of independence and declared statehood, Joe's quiet diplomacy continued. He became a ghost in the machinery of nation-building. His lawyers, paid from untraceable accounts, began submitting detailed, hypothetical proposals to contacts within Israel's fledgling finance ministry. The proposals were masterpieces of financial engineering, wrapped in the patriotic language of national development. He was playing a long, deep game. While the syndicate licked its wounds from Vegas and focused on domestic troubles, Joe was laying the groundwork for their next, greatest escape hatch. He wasn't just buying into a country. He was subtly helping to design a clause in its financial constitution. One evening, Meyer Lansky himself came to Joe's unassuming office. He looked older, wearier, the pressure of federal scrutiny beginning to etch itself around his eyes. You've been quiet, document, and you're sending money to places I can't follow on a map. I'm building a basement, Meyer, Joe said, unlocking a drawer and pulling out a map not of the U.S., but of the Eastern Mediterranean. Vegas is the penthouse. It's beautiful. It's also a target. Every cop, every taxman, every senator with a moral streak has it in their sights. You need a place where you can store the furniture when they come to raid the penthouse. Lansky's finger traced the coastline to a specific point. Here. It's not a casino, Meyer. It's a vault, with a flag, and an army, and a reason to protect what's inside. A slow, grim smile spread across Lansky's face. It was the smile of a man who saw a checkmate several moves ahead. You're talking about making our money a matter of Israeli national security. Joe simply nodded. I'm talking about making it legal, somewhere else. The project had a code name, used only between them and their most trusted lawyers. Operation Castling. It was the chess move where the king finds safety behind a wall of pawns. Joe Stacher, the quiet boy from Horodenka, was no longer just laundering money. He was negotiating to launder an entire fortune's sovereignty. The desert had been a test. The promised land was to be the final, unassailable fortress. The state of Israel, in its first feverish years, was not a place, it was a verb. It was an act of furious becoming. The air in Tel Aviv vibrated not with the lazy heat of Nevada, but with the frantic energy of construction, argument, and a desperate, collective will to survive. To Joe Stacher, stepping off the plane in 1950, it felt familiar. It felt like the Lower East Side, amplified by a million souls and projected onto a historic stage. Here, too, people were building a new world from the scraps of shattered old ones. He came not as Doc Stacher, but as Joseph Stacher, philanthropist and financial consultant. He wore a lightweight suit and carried a briefcase containing not ledgers of illicit profit, but prospectuses for cement plants and proposals for irrigation pipelines. His first meetings were not in back rooms, but in the makeshift, sun-blasted offices of the Ministry of Finance and the Jewish Agency. The men he met were not gangsters. They were nation builders, weary, idealistic, and pragmatic to the bone. His primary contact, Jacob Eshkol, now a rising power within the Ministry of Finance, greeted him with a firm handshake and eyes ringed with exhaustion. "Welcome to the startup, Mr. Stacher. Our books are open, but you will find the ink is still wet." Joe's strategy was one of layered legitimacy. His first layer was public and pure, significant, traceable donations to the United Jewish Appeal, earmarked for specific, tangible projects, a reservoir in the Negev, a wing of a hospital in Haifa. The checks cleared from respectable banks in Switzerland. This made him a macker, a doer, a man whose commitment was concrete. The second layer was his advisory role. He offered pro bono the services of his team of international tax and banking attorneys to the overwhelmed Israeli legal teams who were trying to craft a commercial code from scratch. "You are creating the syntax for your economy," he told a room of young, brilliant Israeli lawyers. "Let us help ensure the grammar is attractive to foreign direct investment." His lawyers, the best money could buy, worked tirelessly, subtly weaving concepts of banking secrecy, confidential client privilege, and favorable treatment of foreign capital into the dry legalese of the new state's financial regulations. It was a masterclass in legal alchemy, turning the base metal of oversight into the gold of discretion. But the third layer, the true core of Operation Castling, was discussed only in hushed tones during private walks along the Tel Aviv seafront at dusk, with the Mediterranean washing the shore and masking. Their words. "The principle is mutual security," Joe explained to Eshkol, his voice barely louder than the surf. "Our capital provides you with liquidity and hard currency independence, resources your enemies cannot blockade. It builds your infrastructure faster than any loan from a hesitant Washington. In return, your sovereignty provides our capital with a shield. A bank chartered here, operating under these new principles we are drafting, becomes an extension of Israeli soil. Its secrets are protected by your national interest." Eshkol, a realist, understood the bargain. He was not buying dirty money. He was renting the inviolability of a young nation's sovereignty to the highest, most discreet bidders. It was a cold transaction, but one that could fund 100 kibbutzim and arm a dozen brigades. However, Joe encountered an obstacle he hadn't fully calculated: the fierce, incorruptible idealism of Israel's founding generation. Not everyone saw the world through Eshkol's pragmatic lens. There were ministers, veterans of the War of Independence, who spoke of clean hands and moral capital. They viewed Stacher's largesse with deep suspicion. A rumor began to circulate, whispered in the halls of the Knesset, that the smooth American with the quiet voice and the open checkbook was a front for the kosher nostra, a phrase that had begun to appear in American newspapers linking Jewish mobsters to Zionism. This was a danger more potent than any FBI investigation. It was a threat to the legitimacy of the entire project. If Stacher became publicly toxic, the legal architecture he was helping to build would be tainted by association and dismantled. He needed a higher level of cover. He needed not just a financier's acceptance, but a statesman's tacit blessing. He needed to meet David Ben-Gurion. The old man, Israel's first prime minister, was a figure of monolithic intensity. Getting an audience was nearly impossible. Joe didn't try through back channels. Instead, he doubled down on the first layer, legitimacy. He funded an archaeological dig near Jerusalem, appealing to Ben-Gurion's deep passion for connecting the new state to its ancient roots. He made a widely publicized donation to the Israeli Philharmonic Orchestra, an institution Ben-Gurion cherished as a symbol of cultural refinement. Finally, the opportunity came. Not a private meeting, but a reception following the dedication of a new library at the Weizmann Institute. Ben-Gurion was there, holding court in a circle of scientists. Joe waited at the periphery. When the crowd shifted, Eshkol, seizing the moment, gently steered Ben-Gurion towards him. "Prime Minister, this is Joseph Stacher, one of our most dedicated supporters from America. He funded the Negev Reservoir project." Ben-Gurion fixed him with those famous, bushy-browed eyes, eyes that had seen empires fall and a nation rise. The gaze was disconcertingly direct, stripping away pretense. Stacher, you give to water. Water is life. Why? The room seemed to quiet. This wasn't small talk. It was an interrogation of motive. Joe met his gaze, his own calm and steady. Because a nation, like a man, needs a firm foundation to stand tall. You can't build on sand. You build on rock. And water finds the cracks in everything. It either destroys or it makes the foundation stronger. I prefer to help with the latter. He wasn't talking about hydrology. He was talking about capital, about pressure, about the corrosive or constructive power of immense resource. A long, silent moment passed. Ben-Gurion's expression was unreadable. Then he gave a single, slow nod. He said nothing more to Joe, turning back to the scientists. But he had not dismissed him. He had considered him. That nod was the key. The whisper campaign in the Knesset didn't die, but it lost its lethal force. The message was clear. Stacher was a useful tool, and Ben-Gurion would not break a useful tool over a matter of vague rumors. The old man's pragmatism had outweighed his scruples. With this fragile, unspoken protection, Joe's work accelerated. The first of his special banks, the Foreign Trade and Credit Bank, began to take shape on paper. Its proposed charter was a thing of beauty, a sovereign-backed safe for international capital. But as he prepared to finalize the plans, a new problem arose from an unexpected quarter. A brilliant, dogged young official in the Bank of Israel, a Holocaust survivor named Raphael with a profound aversion to shadows, began asking pointed, technical questions about the ultimate beneficial ownership of the capital poised to flow into these new institutions. Joe had navigated American cops, rival gangsters, and visionary fools. Now he faced perhaps his most dangerous adversary, an honest, meticulous bureaucrat with nothing to hide and everything to prove. The fortress was almost built, but someone was intently studying the blueprints, looking for a hidden door. Raphael's office was a cubicle, not a room. It was buried in the sublevel of the temporary Bank of Israel headquarters, a converted schoolhouse in Tel Aviv. The space smelled of damp concrete, stale coffee, and paper, reams and reams of it. Files were stacked in teetering pillars on the floor, on the chair, on the single shelf behind the desk. In the center of this organized chaos sat Raphael himself, a man in his late 30s with wire-rimmed glasses and the intense, hollowed-out look of someone who had survived on intellect and nerves alone. He was a forensic accountant before the term existed. A Holocaust survivor from Vilnius, he had lost his entire family. What he had salvaged was a preternatural ability to find patterns, inconsistencies, the ghost in the machine of any financial statement. To Raphael, numbers were not abstractions. They were a moral ledger. A hidden column, an obscured source, was not just bad business, it was a lie. And after the lies that had swallowed his world, he was building his new life on a bedrock of absolute, transparent truth. He had come across the draft charter for the Foreign Trade and Credit Bank as part of a routine review. On the surface, it was a masterpiece, a forward-thinking instrument to attract foreign investment. But certain phrases snagged his attention like a loose thread on a fine suit. Clients may be represented by fiduciary agents. The source of seed capital is protected under commercial confidentiality statutes. It was all legally defensible, even innovative, but to Raphael it smelled. It smelled of layers, of distance, of money that did not wish to be known. He began a quiet, solitary inquest. He cross-referenced the names of the lawyers who drafted the clauses with other filings. He found connections to corporate entities in Panama, in Luxembourg. He traced the philanthropic donations from Joseph Stacher back through a chain of Swiss accounts that, while private, had transaction patterns that suggested they were conduits, not sources. Raphael didn't know about the kosher nostra. He didn't think in terms of gangsters. He thought in terms of obfuscation. And in a young nation fighting for its ethical as well as its physical survival, obfuscation of capital was, to him, an existential threat. If the foundation was built with hidden, dirty stones, the whole structure was compromised. He prepared a memo, not an accusation, a series of questions. 27 precise, technical, devastating questions about beneficial ownership, capital origination, and compliance with emerging international banking norms. He sent it up the chain to his direct superior and copied the legal department. The memo landed on Jacob Eshkal's desk like a live grenade. Eshkal immediately called Joe Stacher, who was by then splitting his time between Tel Aviv and Zurich. "We have a problem. A clerk. A very smart, very persistent clerk. He has asked questions we cannot answer." Joe, in his Zurich hotel room, listened calmly. "What does he want?" "He wants the truth." "The truth is complicated," Joe said. "Send me the memo." When the document arrived, Joe studied it not with anger, but with a kind of professional admiration. Raphael was good. He had followed the scent to the outer wall of the fortress. He hadn't found the door, but he had correctly deduced there must be one, and he was measuring the stones, looking for a crack. The old ways, intimidation, bribery, violence, were not just wrong here. They were impossible. This was Israel. Raphael was a hero of the nation, a survivor. Touching him would ignite a fire that would consume everything, including Ben-Gurion's tacit protection. This threat required a solution in keeping with the new environment. A bureaucratic, legal, and psychological solution. Joe flew back to Tel Aviv. He did not ask to meet Raphael. Instead, he asked Eshkal to convene a meeting of the Special Banking Committee and to invite Raphael to present his concerns. "Give him the floor. Let him speak to the room." Eshkal was horrified. "You want to give him a platform?" "I want to see what he's made of," Joe replied. "And I want him to see the room." The meeting was held in a sparse conference room. Around the table sat Eshkal, 2 other senior finance ministry officials, 3 lawyers, 2 of them quietly on Joe's payroll, and Raphael, looking incongruous in his worn suit. Joe sat slightly apart, an observer. Raphael presented his memo. He was not theatrical, he was exacting. He pointed to each clause, each connection, with the calm, relentless logic of a mathematician proving a theorem. "The proposed structure creates a vessel," he concluded, "but declines to certify the integrity of the material from which the vessel is made. For a nation building its financial reputation on trust, this is a dangerous precedent. We must insist on transparency, all the way down." When he finished, there was silence. The officials looked uncomfortable. The lawyers were poised to rebut. But Joe spoke first. "Thank you, Mr. Raphael," Joe said, his voice respectful, even warm. "That was exceptional work. Truly, you have a gift for seeing not just the numbers, but the spaces between them." Raphael blinked, thrown off balance by the praise. "You are absolutely right," Joe continued, stunning the room. "Trust is our only currency. More than the dollar, more than the pound. And you have identified a genuine vulnerability in the draft. Not a flaw of intent, but a flaw of perception. If a man of your integrity sees a shadow, then the world will see a cavern." He paused, letting his words hang. He was reframing the problem entirely, from one of hidden guilt to one of imperfect communication. "Therefore," Joe said, turning to the committee, "I propose we adopt Mr. Raphael's principle. Full transparency. But we must be smart about it. We are not asking a survivor of war to divulge his life savings to a clerk. We are asking sophisticated international partners to trust a new nation. So we create a new tier, a sovereign review board, not a low-level clerk, but a committee appointed by the finance minister himself. Men of unimpeachable reputation, former judges, renowned economists. This board will have the absolute authority to see everything. The ultimate beneficial ownership, the source of funds, everything. Their deliberations will be sealed in perpetuity, protected by state secrecy laws. The capital is transparent to the sovereign and thus pure. But its privacy from competitors, from hostile foreign governments, from extortionists, remains intact. It was a breathtaking move. He had taken Raphael's demand for transparency and turned it into a proposal for an even more powerful, secretive, and elite layer of control. A control that would, in practice, be far easier to manage and influence than a lone, stubborn clerk. He was offering to make the state itself the co-conspirator in secrecy. The officials around the table began to nod. This sounded responsible, statesmanlike, secure. Raphael stared at Joe. He saw the trap. He saw that his pure demand had been absorbed and was being transformed into its opposite. But he was outmaneuvered. He could not argue against a review board of distinguished men. To do so would make him seem paranoid, unreasonable, a mere clerk opposing wisdom. Who would sit on this board? Raphael asked, his voice tight. People you would trust, Joe said softly, meeting his eyes. People the Prime Minister would trust. People whose integrity is the integrity of the state itself. The meeting adjourned with a decision to draft an amendment to the bank's charter, creating the Sovereign Financial Review Board. Raphael left the room defeated, knowing he had been used to build a stronger, more legitimate-looking lock for the very door he wanted to open. Later, alone with Eshkol, Joe allowed himself a thin smile. Your clerk is a patriot. We need more like him. Perhaps he should be promoted, given a broader portfolio away from specific banking charters. Maybe international loan compliance, a role that uses his talents, keeps him honored, and keeps him very, very busy. Eshkol understood. Not a bullet, not a bribe.
À promotion.
A golden handcuff of responsibility that would redirect that sharp, probing mind elsewhere. The fortress now had its final, brilliant feature. A formidable, official-looking gatehouse, manned by distinguished guardians. And Joseph Stacher held the only key to the gatehouse. Raphael's truth had been processed, sanitized, and turned into the most effective disguise of all. The appearance of absolute state-sanctioned scrutiny. Joseph Stacher's system in Israel worked, for a time, with a cool, elegant efficiency. The financial fortress he helped design stood firm, its walls built from legal statutes and sovereign discretion. Capital flowed, was cleansed, and was reinvested, all within the protective shell of a nation's desperate need. He became a ghost in the machine of a new state, his influence felt but his name rarely spoken in official halls. But no system, no matter how brilliantly conceived, is immune to the tides of politics and scrutiny. The very American attention he had sought to escape eventually turned its gaze across the ocean. In the early 1960s, as U.S. Senate committees and the FBI intensified their focus on organized crime's international ties, the trail began to lead to Tel Aviv and Zurich. The Kosher Nostra whispers became headlines. Pressure mounted on the Israeli government from its American allies. The end for Joe came not with a dramatic raid, but with a quiet, crushing legalism. In 1965, the U.S. government moved to revoke his citizenship, not for murder or racketeering, crimes they couldn't conclusively pin on the quiet financier, but for fraud in its original procurement decades prior. It was the most mundane of offenses, a paper cut that bled out his entire American life. He was deported, but not to a prison cell. He was exiled to the very fortress he had built, Israel. For a few years, he lived there, a king in a gilded cage, protected by the very laws he'd helped draft. But the political winds shifted again. Embarrassed by the notoriety, a new Israeli government, eager to prove its moral standing, quietly made it clear he was no longer welcome. His final exile was to Zurich, Switzerland, the neutral ground of numbered accounts and eternal discretion. He died there in 1977, of a heart attack, in a comfortable apartment far from the dusty heat of Horodenka, the frantic energy of the Lower East Side, and the glittering mirage of Las Vegas. There was no dramatic deathbed confession, no final tally of his billions. He simply ceased to be, his passing noted in a few newspaper paragraphs that called him a mob associate and financier, labels that failed to capture the scale of his architectural genius. His legacy was not a name on a building or a street. It was a blueprint. He had proven that the most powerful criminal enterprise isn't the one that controls the street, but the one that designs the financial system the street runs on. The offshore banking havens, the layers of corporate secrecy, the use of sovereign states as privacy shields, these were the tools he helped pioneer and perfect. In the end, the silent boy who had learned to listen to the whispers of money became the man who taught the underworld how to make its fortune disappear into the global system's silent places. He wasn't a kingpin or a soldier. He was the cartographer of the shadows, drawing the maps that others would follow for decades to come. The machine he built didn't die with him. It simply evolved, and in doing so wrote his true, enduring epitaph, the man who made crime a matter of international finance.